Here's something that doesn't quite add up. Every egg carton in the store came from a flock of hens, and somewhere out there, each of those hens had brothers. So where did all of them go? Hens produce eggs. Roosters never do. And that single fact creates an odd dilemma. An egg operation depends entirely on female birds, yet close to half of every hatch comes out male. So where does that other half end up? Are they fattened up and sold as meat? Do they just grow into breeding roosters? Or do they simply vanish from the system? And more specifically, why don't we eat male chickens the same way we eat their sisters? The answer starts with one small biological fact, and that fact reshaped the entire poultry business. Let's clear up a misconception first, right at the start. Male chicken meat isn't dangerous, unpleasant, or somehow off limits. Roosters have ended up on dinner plates for thousands of years across dozens of cultures, and plenty of people still eat them today. So the real question isn't whether male chickens can be eaten. It's why they aren't raised as meat on anything close to the scale their sisters are raised for eggs. And the honest answer has almost nothing to do with biology and almost everything to do with arithmetic. If that surprises you, stick around, because the rest of this story gets stranger. And if you want more of these deep dives into the systems behind everyday food, go ahead and subscribe now. Here's the arithmetic. Modern chickens aren't really one animal anymore. They're two separate products wearing the same feathers. One lineage was bred for laying, the other for growing, and over the last century, those two lineages have drifted apart so far that they barely resemble the same species in terms of what their bodies are built to do. Both are still, technically, chickens, capable of interbreeding, sharing the same basic anatomy. But generations of selective breeding pushed one group toward maximum egg output and the other toward maximum muscle growth, and almost nothing in between survived commercially. Take the laying line first. The dominant commercial layer breed in the United States is the white leghorn, a lean, small-framed bird originally from Italy that was refined over the 20th century into an astonishing egg production machine. A modern commercial hen can lay close to 300 eggs a year, an output that would have seemed almost impossible to a farmer a century ago, when a backyard hen might produce somewhere closer to 150. That leap in output didn't happen by accident. Breeders spent decades selecting hens for early maturity, consistent laying cycles, and calm temperaments that tolerate crowded housing, essentially engineering the bird's entire reproductive biology around a single output. But a male chick from that same laying line can't lay a single egg, obviously, and he also doesn't grow into a particularly good meat bird. Laying breeds are bred to stay lean and metabolically efficient at converting feed into eggs, not muscle. Feed a leghorn male for months, and he stays comparatively small-framed, converts feed to body weight slowly, and never catches up in size or meat yield to a bird bred specifically for the dinner table. That's where the second lineage comes in, and its origin story is more deliberate than most people realize. The specialized meat chicken industry is generally traced back to a Delaware farmer named Cecile Steele, who, in 1923, received an oversized shipment of 500 chicks instead of the 50 she'd ordered and decided to raise the surplus specifically for meat rather than eggs. The batch sold well enough that raising chickens purely for meat, rather than as a byproduct of egg farming, became its own industry almost overnight along the Delmarva Peninsula. That idea was formalized decades later. In 1948, a nationwide competition called the Chicken of Tomorrow Contest, backed by the grocery chain A&P and the United States Department of Agriculture, challenged breeders to develop a chicken that could grow faster, bigger, and meatier than anything on the market. The winning genetics from that contest became the foundation of what we now call the broiler chicken, and decades of continued selective breeding since then have pushed those bloodlines even further. Today, that breeding work is concentrated in the hands of remarkably few companies. Roughly 90% of the broiler chickens raised worldwide descend from genetics controlled by just two breeding companies: Aviagen, which produces the Ross line, and Cobb Vantris, which produces the Cobb line. Nearly every chicken breast sold in an American supermarket traces back to one of those two proprietary bloodlines, refined over decades purely for growth, speed, and meat yield. A standard commercial broiler from either line can reach market weight in roughly 6 to 7 weeks, a pace that would have taken a farmyard bird 4 or 5 times as long a century earlier. Modern broilers also convert feed into muscle with remarkable efficiency, often needing somewhere around 1.5 to 2 pounds of feed for every pound of body weight gained, a ratio that a layer breed's male offspring simply can't match. That growth rate isn't free of controversy, and it's worth being honest about the debate here rather than glossing over it. Veterinarians and animal welfare researchers have raised concerns for years about leg disorders, heart problems, and other health issues tied to breeding chickens to grow that quickly, since skeletal and cardiovascular development doesn't always keep pace with rapid muscle gain. That concern is part of why a slower growing broiler movement, backed by organizations like the Global Animal Partnership, has been gaining traction with some retailers and restaurant chains over the past decade. But from a pure production standpoint, even a welfare conscious, slower growing broiler still converts feed into meat far more efficiently than a laying breed's male offspring ever could. So, raising the layer breed's brothers for meat isn't biologically impossible. It's just consistently less profitable than raising a bird engineered for exactly that purpose from the ground up. Once you separate chickens into these two specialized categories, the male chick problem becomes almost mathematical. A hatchery producing laying hens has no commercial use for roughly half of what it hatches. Those males can't lay eggs, and raising them competitively against purpose-built broilers rarely pencils out once you account for feed costs, housing space, water, veterinary care, and the months of labor involved, all of it stacked against a bird that will never grow into a broiler's size or sell for a broiler's price. Historically, this wasn't much of an issue at all. A small family farm kept a handful of roosters for breeding and for general flock order, and any extra males simply went into the stew pot or the market stall down the road with nothing wasted and nothing left over to explain away. Heritage breeds like the Rhode Island Red, the Plymouth Rock, and the Orpington were bred as dual-purpose birds, decent at both laying and growing, precisely because a farm with 30 chickens couldn't afford to run two separate specialized flocks. But once egg production scaled into hatcheries producing hundreds of thousands, even millions, of chicks a year, that old dual-purpose model stopped making economic sense, and the sheer number of unwanted males turned from a minor inconvenience into an industrial-scale problem. For decades, the industry's answer was blunt. Male chicks from laying breeds were separated shortly after hatching and killed, usually within their first day of life, through methods such as high-speed grinding or exposure to carbon dioxide gas. This practice is known as male chick culling, and it has become one of the most publicly criticized aspects of modern egg production, drawing sustained pressure from animal welfare groups for years. It's worth being direct about why it happened. It wasn't because male chickens are inherently worthless animals. It's that feeding and housing millions of birds that couldn't be sold profitably made no economic sense within the system as it was built. And for most of the 20th century, nobody had a cheaper alternative. The scale of this practice is genuinely hard to picture. Global animal welfare organizations, including Compassion in World Farming, have estimated that somewhere around 6 to 7 billion male chicks are culled worldwide every single year, a number driven almost entirely by how enormous the global egg industry has become. To put that in perspective, the entire human population of the planet is a little over 8 billion. Every year, the egg industry produces roughly that many unwanted male chicks, give or take. Almost all of them culled within hours of hatching. That figure alone is a big part of why this issue moved from a niche agricultural detail into a mainstream ethical debate over the past 15 years or so, showing up in documentaries, legislative hearings, and grocery store labeling decisions. It's also worth noting that chickens aren't the only animal where this exact problem shows up. Dairy farming runs into a strikingly similar arithmetic problem with male calves. A dairy cow only produces milk after giving birth, and roughly half of those births are male calves that will never produce milk themselves and aren't typically well suited to the beef industry's preferred breeds. For years, many male dairy calves were simply destroyed shortly after birth for similar economic reasons, though that practice has drawn its own wave of scrutiny, and some dairy operations have shifted toward raising male calves for veal or crossbreeding with beef genetics instead. The chicken industry's male chick problem, in other words, isn't some strange one-off quirk of poultry biology. It's what happens fairly predictably whenever human breeding pushes an animal toward producing one specific output, like milk or eggs, using only one sex of the species. The industry has known this looked bad for a long time, and it's worth tracking exactly what was promised versus what actually happened. In 2016, the United Egg Producers, the trade group representing the large majority of American egg farms, publicly pledged to eliminate chick culling by the year 2020, once a scalable alternative became commercially available. That deadline came and went without the pledge being met, largely because the sexing technology capable of replacing culling wasn't yet cheap or fast enough for large hatcheries to install nationwide. That gap between promise and practice is itself part of this story, and it points toward the real solution researchers had been racing to build all along: figuring out an egg's sex before it ever hatches at all. The approach is called in ovo sexing, and it works by identifying the sex of a developing embryo while it's still inside the shell, so male eggs can be pulled from the incubator early rather than allowed to hatch and then be culled. Several methods have now reached commercial use. A German company called Select developed a technique that extracts a tiny sample of fluid from the egg around day 9 of incubation and tests it for a hormone marker that differs between male and female embryos. Another company, Agri Advanced Technologies, uses spectroscopic imaging to detect blood vessel patterns and other biological markers even earlier, sometimes within the first few days after the egg is laid, before most people would consider the embryo to have any nervous system at all, a detail that matters in the welfare debate around timing. These technologies aren't universal yet, and they aren't cheap to install in an existing hatchery, but they're spreading quickly in certain markets, specifically because regulation is pushing them there. Germany banned chick culling outright, starting in January of 2022, and France and Italy followed with their own restrictions shortly after. In those countries, in ovo sexing isn't just an option anymore, it's effectively mandatory, and the rest of the European Union has debated similar rules, though a block-wide ban has not yet been formally adopted as of this recording. It's worth pausing here to note why turkeys, ducks, and most other farmed poultry don't run into anything close to this same problem. Commercial turkeys and ducks are almost always raised as single-purpose meat birds from the start, with both males and females going straight into meat production, since neither sex is bred for large-scale egg output the way laying hens are. Male turkeys, in fact, are often specifically favored for meat because they simply grow larger than females. The male chicken problem exists specifically because the egg industry and the meat industry both use the same species, chicken, but have bred it into two genetically distinct populations optimized for opposite outcomes. Remove that split, as the turkey and duck industries largely have, and the male chick dilemma mostly disappears. There's another approach worth knowing about, and it solves the problem in a very different way by simply refusing to waste the males in the first place. In Germany, a project called the Bruderhahn Initiative, which translates roughly to Brother Rooster Initiative, pairs egg production with meat production directly. Consumers who buy eggs from participating farms pay a small premium, sometimes just a few cents per egg, and that premium funds raising the male chicks, the layer hens' actual brothers, to full size for meat instead of culling them. It's noticeably less efficient than running a specialized broiler operation, and the resulting meat costs more to produce and to buy, but it gives every hatched chick, male or female, an economic purpose within the same farm. Similar dual-purpose models have popped up in small pockets of the United States and the United Kingdom, sometimes marketed under labels referencing circle eggs or respectful sourcing, though they still represent a tiny fraction of the overall egg market compared to conventional production. Zoom out further, and the male chicken story gets even more interesting, because for most of human history, roosters weren't an afterthought at all. Genetic research generally traces the domestication of the chicken back to the red jungle fowl, a wild, pheasant-like bird native to South and Southeast Asia. Researchers still disagree on exactly when that domestication happened. Older estimates, based mostly on archaeological bone finds, place it at roughly 8,000 years ago. But a widely discussed genetic study published in 2020 argued the real timeline is closer to 3,500 years ago, tied to the spread of rice and millet farming, which likely first drew wild jungle fowl into close contact with human settlements looking for spilled grain. That debate hasn't been settled among archaeologists and geneticists, and it's a good example of how even something as familiar as the backyard chicken still holds open scientific questions. Large-scale artificial incubation, the very technology that later made industrial hatcheries possible, also has a surprisingly old history. Ancient Egyptian farmers were operating massive mud brick egg incubators, capable of hatching thousands of chicks at once without a hen ever sitting on the eggs. As far back as several centuries before the Common Era, a practice that stunned European travelers who documented it centuries later because nothing comparable existed yet in Europe. In a real sense, the basic idea behind a modern industrial hatchery, separating hatching from the mother bird entirely and producing chicks at massive scale, is not a 20th century invention at all. It's thousands of years old. What changed in the 20th century wasn't the concept. It was combining that ancient incubation trick with genetically specialized breeds and, eventually, with the economic pressure that turned every unproductive male chick into a cost that needed to be eliminated as efficiently as possible. Once domesticated, roosters carried enormous cultural weight well beyond meat and eggs. Their crowing marked the start of the day for millennia before mechanical clocks existed, which is part of why roosters became linked symbolically with vigilance and the sun in cultures from ancient Persia to Rome to Japan. Their natural aggression made them central to cockfighting across ancient Rome, throughout Southeast Asia, and later in colonial America, a practice that shaped how roosters were bred and valued for centuries, sometimes making a single prized fighting bird worth far more than an entire flock of hens. Cockfighting is now illegal in all 50 American states, with Louisiana becoming the last state to ban it in 2008. Though the practice persists in parts of the world where it remains a significant part of local tradition, when older roosters were eaten historically, their tougher, more exercised muscle was rarely fried or roasted quickly. It went into slow, moist cooking instead. The same logic behind French coq au vin, Filipino tinola, and countless regional stews, built around long, simmering times that break down tougher muscle fiber. None of that required a specialized meat breed. It just required patience in the kitchen and a bird that had already lived a working life. That older model, one bird serving multiple purposes across its lifetime, started breaking down once agriculture industrialized in the middle of the 20th century. When a farm is raising a few dozen chickens, an unproductive rooster is a minor cost, easily absorbed into the household budget. When a hatchery is producing hundreds of thousands of chicks a week, every single animal that doesn't generate revenue becomes a measurable drain on feed, water, housing space, and labor multiplied across an enormous scale. The industry's response wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was the same logic that shows up in almost every large manufacturing system. Instead of one flexible product trying to do several jobs adequately, build two specialized ones that each do a single job extremely well and let the market decide which specialization survives. Chickens simply became the agricultural version of that principle, split into an egg-making lineage and a meat-making lineage, with the male half of the egg-making lineage caught in between, biologically real but economically inconvenient, within a system that had no slot built for him. There are also consumers pushing back against that logic directly, which is worth mentioning as part of where this story is heading rather than where it's been. Certified humane and no-kill egg labels have started appearing on shelves at retailers including Whole Foods, typically indicating that the eggs came from a supply chain using in ovo sexing or a dual-purpose model rather than conventional culling. These products remain more expensive and less widely available than standard eggs, and adoption varies enormously by country and by retailer. But the trend line over the past several years has moved in one consistent direction, toward giving the male chick somewhere to go besides an early grinder. Some grocery chains in Europe have gone further and committed to phasing out culled chick eggs from their private label lines entirely over the next several years, which puts direct pressure on suppliers to adopt in ovo sexing, regardless of what national law requires. In the United States, the shift has moved more slowly, partly because federal regulation hasn't mandated any change, and partly because the sexing technology itself is still being scaled up and adapted for the country's much larger hatcheries. So, why don't we eat male chickens? The honest answer is that, in a narrow sense, we sometimes do, and increasingly more often as programs like in ovo sexing and dual purpose farming expand across parts of Europe and slowly into North America. But within the dominant model of modern egg production, most male chicks were never raised for meat because they came from a lineage optimized specifically for laying eggs rather than growing muscle efficiently, and raising them competitively against purpose-built broiler chickens rarely made financial sense once agriculture industrialized. Male chickens weren't excluded from the food system, because their meat was inedible or undesirable. They were excluded because an industrial system built almost entirely around efficiency had no economic slot to put them in. That's beginning to change, driven by consumer pressure, regulation in places like Germany, France, and Italy, and technology that can now sort eggs by sex before a single unwanted chick is ever hatched at all. It's a rare case where a problem created almost entirely by industrial scale efficiency is now being solved by a more precise form of that same efficiency, catching the answer at the embryo stage instead of at the hatchery floor. Whether that shift ever reaches the scale of the American egg industry, with its enormous hatcheries and razor thin margins, remains an open question, and it's likely to depend as much on regulation and consumer demand as on the underlying science. The chicken in your refrigerator, the eggs in your carton, and the rooster crowing on a farm somewhere are all, technically, the same species. But after thousands of years of selective breeding pulling them in opposite directions, they stopped doing the same job a long time ago. The male chicken didn't disappear from the dinner table because nature made him useless. He disappeared because humans built an entire system almost entirely around his sisters, and only now, slowly, is that system being rebuilt to make room for him, too.